For most of its history, AID focused a lot of attention on the more traditional kinds of development assistance, economic development, support for improved governance, humanitarian responses, those sorts of things. And in the 1990s, we found ourselves increasingly asked to respond to complex humanitarian emergencies in places like Somalia and Rwanda and the former Yugoslavia. So in 2002, CMM was the agency's response to that realization, and knowing that we couldn't really do development as usual anymore, we as an agency needed to explicitly focus on conflict and to focus on how our programs were being affected by the dynamics of conflict, as well as how our programs were having an impact on conflict. So CMM's fundamental mandate is really to mainstream attention to conflict throughout all the sectoral work of the agency. And why do we care about climate change specifically? We spend a lot of our time looking at natural resources issues, and while we know that natural resources alone are neither necessary nor sufficient to drive conflict, we do know that competition over resources and their revenues often helps to drive conflict and to sustain it over time. We also know that climate change impacts are going to interact with those dynamics, so we need to better understand how in order to really program effectively against it in the future. So I thought I would organize my presentation by talking a little bit about threats, opportunities, and what we intend to do about it when it comes to climate change. So as you all know from reading all the media reports over the last decade, science tells us that increasing global temperatures will affect climate patterns in some pretty unsettling ways. They are going to expose people to increased resource scarcity, could cause damage to crops and housing, heighten exposure to diseases. However, I think it's important to remember that climate change, like any global issue, is not going to be universally negative, and it is not really just a threat to be mitigated against, but it's an opportunity if we seize it right. So the issue of climate security is a relatively new one on the scene, and as Jeff mentioned, one that we're paying increasing attention to as of late. The science of analyzing both the risks of climate impacts and the risks of conflict is pretty uncertain. They're both still evolving, and there's a very limited evidence base of real-world analysis from which we can draw about this intersection. And a lot of the attention as of late has sort of tended towards hyperbole around how climate and conflict will interact in the future. So I think it's really important that we avoid oversimplification, and we really focus as peacebuilding and conflict practitioners on the reality that conflict is such a complex phenomenon, and that opens a lot of opportunities for various points of intervention. I would stress that we need to think about both the risk and the resiliency side of the equation, and to look at the openings that are offered by climate change policies and programs to address conflict risks and to build peace as we're looking for opportunities to enhance climate resiliency.